Alright, welcome to this week's video lecture on Chapter 9, which deals with crimes against persons, in particular murder and manslaughter. So we want to start off noting that murders and manslaughters are relatively rare. There are not that many in comparison to other crimes. Generally, assaults are more common crimes. So we can kind of see that murder is way down here at the bottom. Now, so with homicides and manslaughters, the harm almost always involves a death. So most criminal law pertaining to homicides and murders focus on answering the question of, is this event first or second degree? Is this a murder or manslaughter? And how we know what we're looking for is we look at the elements of criminal homicide. So the actus reus, the mens rea, and mitigating and aggravating circumstances are what will clue us in on the grade and seriousness. Another reason that matters for defendants is it impacts how long they're going to be punished for it. Further on, for those who are convicted of first-degree murder in death penalty states, they might receive the death penalty, and in other states they might receive life in prison without parole. So serious punishments are on the table. Now, your book starts off with noting that it's only a crime to kill a fetus in 24 states. These statutes are pretty new, and they have primarily involved revising existing statutes to include a fetus as in the definition of person. A few states have taken a different tactic and defined an entirely new crime of feticide. When life ends, it used to be fairly easy to define because the death would be fairly immediate, and under the common law, as long as it happened within 1 year and 1 day of the act, the person, the aggressor, was responsible. However, with the advances in healthcare and medicine, it is not as easy to define, and we rely on Uniform Brain Death Act to kind of help, and we have kind of shifted what it means to be alive and what it means to die. Now, these two slides I'm skipping over deal with the history of murder law. Your book does a really great job here. It's extremely clear. Let's focus in on the elements of murder. So what are the actus reus, the mens rea, the causation, death, and attendant circumstances? So for murder, the actus reus could include a multitude of voluntary actions. Anything that involves a voluntary act of killing another person. The mens rea for first degree is purposely, for second degree is knowingly, and for third degree in manslaughters is extremely recklessly. There are aggravating circumstances for first degree murder, and the criminal harm is the death of the victim. In the United States, the degrees are defined by statutes. So almost all states have two types of murder. There's the premeditated and deliberate murder, and some individuals who engage in felony murder are also charged with first degree. Some of the aggravating factors for that might include the death penalty include that the person was already incarcerated, the person's been convicted of other violent crimes, the defendant committed more than one murder, things like that. Mitigating factors are frequently the defendant's rely on the defendant's past. Do they have no record of criminal activity? Were they under the influence of extreme emotional or mental health disturbance, things like that. Okay. Second degree murders in most states is anything else that is not a first degree murder. And only a few states in our country have depraved heart murders, sometimes called third-degree murders, and this is unintentional but an extremely reckless murder. So an example of this might be someone is on a roof and they're repairing the roof and they have a rotten board, they pick it up, they pull it off, and they throw it down to the ground below them, and unknown to them the board hits two people on the sidewalk and they both die from the injuries they sustain. That would be a depraved heart murder. A different type of murder is felony murder. This is an unintentional death during the commission of some felonies. Frequently, these are restricted to other violent or UCR violent crime felonies. This becomes murder because we substitute the mens rea for the robbery for murder. So there is some debate, and several states have taken steps fairly recently to either eliminate felony murder or seriously restrict it to only a handful of felonies, like aggravated assaults and aggravated robberies. Okay. One additional thing that I would like to talk to you guys about is the deadly weapon doctrine. The deadly weapon doctrine tells us that someone who intentionally uses a deadly weapon on another human being and kills him is thereby presumed to have formed the criminal intent to kill. So that is one way that we approve and establish mens rea, is simply by looking at did they use a weapon or not. And while we are taking a minute to speak about mens rea, and particularly the deadly weapon doctrine, let's talk a little bit about how prosecutors go about proving premeditation and deliberation. There are generally three types of evidence used to show that premeditation and deliberation occurred. The prosecutor will present facts about how and what the defendant did before the death to show that the defendant was engaged in activity intended to plan. Secondarily, the prosecutor will provide evidence about the defendant's prior relationship and conduct with the victim. This will help the jury or fact finder presume motive exists. And lastly, the prosecutor can present facts about the nature of the killing so that the jury could infer the manner of killing was intentional, was deliberate. So those are kind of three broad categories that prosecutors might use to establish premeditated deliberate murder. And there's an example in your book on page 338, State v. Snowden, where Snowden tried to defend his conviction and death sentence by alleging that he did not have time to form malice aforethought, which used to be the language for premeditation and deliberation. And the court disagreed. In that case, he picked somebody with a bar and took her behind a bowling alley and murdered her. And the court discusses that it doesn't have to be this long drawn out process to form mens rea. Okay. So that is mens rea. Let's talk a little bit more about manslaughter at this point. So there are two types of manslaughter. There is voluntary manslaughter, which voluntary manslaughter occurs for the actus reus of the voluntary act of killing another person. The mens rea is a general intent to kill or an intent to inflict a serious bodily injury. We have three circumstance elements here. That the killing occurred in a sudden heat of passion, and adequate provocation exists, or an honest but unreasonable belief that the killing was performed in self-defense. So we talked a little bit about self-defense back in Chapter 5, and so for someone who asserts a failed self-defense claim, they might be able to mitigate the crime from a first or second degree murder to voluntary manslaughter. With the sudden heat of passion, the killing needs to be fairly instantaneous. There cannot be a cooling off period. You can't take time to plan and plot. You need to respond to the provocation fairly immediately. A couple of other things that qualify as adequate provocation are if you're engaged in mutual combat. So in other words, you're fighting, an assault or battery occurs and you respond to it. Now this needs to be more than just a gesture. So if someone flips you off, or that would not be enough. But if they're waving a weapon around, that would be adequate provocation here. Trespassing can be adequate provocation if they invade the home and threaten the occupant with death or adultery. Almost everywhere in the country, spouses who catch their spouse in the middle of adultery would qualify for voluntary manslaughter. One other thing, under the common law, it was the rule that words could never provoke. So adequate provocation had to be more than words. There are a couple of states that have shifted that, where words alone could be a prominent feature in provocation. Still not very common though. Alright. The other type of manslaughter is involuntary manslaughter. These are unintended deaths. Here, the killing happens either through a negligent act or an unlawful act. So the elements are a voluntary act. The actus reus is the voluntary act of killing another. Mens rea is either extremely recklessly or extremely negligently. And the attendant circumstances are that you consciously create a risk, you unconsciously create the risk, or the death occurs during the commission of an unlawful action. So these types of events are almost always accidents. Your book has an example of somebody who was in a parking lot and tapped somebody else who refused to get out of their way and then knocked them down, and they experienced harm. And so it was discussing whether or not this act of vehicular homicide he intended to nudge him, but he inadvertently ran him over. So whether that was an example of involuntary manslaughter, and the court did find that it could be. So the last part of your book this chapter of your book discusses euthanasia. And so it deals a little bit with arguments before and after. It excerpts you to Oregon statute, and it kind of just gives you some examples of how these types of laws are written and how they remove, in states where this is legal, how they remove doctor-assisted suicide from the action of murder or manslaughter. So this is a lot of information. The book is fairly complicated, so please reach out with questions. I look forward to hearing from you.